Concerts entirely devoted to one composer don't always work. There's something about Beethoven that, for some reason, well, it really does. If you put together, as in this concert, an overture, a concerto, and a symphony, there's enough contrast in the extraordinary range of feelings and moods created by the music, in the sounds Beethoven creates, honestly, to make it as varied and as fascinating and as excited and contrastful as any program you could put together with a different array of composers. We start with an overture you might not have heard of, the creatures, or the creations, I think one should say nowadays, of Prometheus. Now, Prometheus was an extraordinarily important figure for the early Romantics. Prometheus in ancient Greek myth was a titan, that's halfway between human beings and a god. And Prometheus defied the commands of the god to give fire, or possibly, maybe allegorically, education, art, creativity, science to human beings. And he was punished for this by the gods, this disobedience, in a particularly cruel and horrible way. But already the Romantics were beginning to see that this figure of the Titan who defies the gods to help human beings could be a marvelous hero in an age of emerging and growing democracy. And Beethoven was very committed to the idea of democracy. He was a huge admirer in the early stages of what had happened in France around the time of the French Revolution, and for a while was a qualified admirer of Napoleon Bonaparte, the great revolutionary hero, although he changed his tune a bit when Napoleon started invading other countries and creating havoc all over the place. Prometheus for Beethoven, I think, was an extremely personally inspiring figure, because Beethoven himself had to endure some suffering too, particularly as a result of his deafness. What a cruel thing to inflict on a brilliant pianist and composer, a man who had started in his early 30s with a dazzling career playing his own concertos on the platform. And eventually, within a decade, he found that he was unable to do this anymore. He was simply actually hemmed in, trapped by his own deafness, and couldn't play in public anymore. And when he tried, apparently, it was pretty catastrophic. But Prometheus had kept going, and already the Romantics were beginning to envision ways in which Prometheus might ultimately triumph over the gods. For instance, Beethoven's contemporary, the poet Shelley, had written a piece called, a huge poem called Prometheus Unbound, in which Prometheus is ultimately victor over even the gods. His defiance of the gods eventually works out to everyone's advantage, including that of Prometheus himself. So Beethoven wrote some music for a ballet on the subject of Prometheus and Prometheus's gifts to humanity, and what Prometheus did, giving humanity the inspiration of science and art and of learning, symbolized in the original story by fire. And he wrote a lot of different numbers for this. But one little idea in the Prometheus ballet ended up being reused in Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, so he was obviously very pleased about it. And the Prometheus Overture is a wonderful curtain raiser. It's a really exciting, tuneful, vigorous piece, full of optimism. And what a marvelous expression of where Beethoven was at this early stage in his career, still full of hope, not only for his own career, but for the world, that eventually democracy might conquer the old order, the repressive conservative powers that prevailed in his lifetime, and create a better world. Well, ultimately he was to be disappointed, but at this stage he didn't know that. The fifth piano concerto, nicknamed the Emperor, although interestingly enough it's only known as that in the English-speaking world. The Germans don't call it the Kaiser Concerto, for instance. It's a very interesting subtitle. Well, definitely the piece has an extremely imperial beginning, because normally in Beethoven's days, concertos didn't begin with the soloist. They would begin with a kind of prelude from the orchestra, which, like an overture in an opera, introduces us to some of the themes we're going to hear and sets the scene and prepares the moment for where in the opera the curtain would go up, where in the concert the concerto soloist starts and claims the stage for his or her own. What Beethoven does in the Emperor Concerto, however, is that the piano comes crashing in right at the beginning with a magnificent cadenza. It's as though the piano is saying, no, no, the orchestra won't have the stage. I am going to take the stage. But then as the piece develops, the relationship between the piano and the orchestra becomes a little bit more complicated and interesting. It isn't all imperial conquest by any means. And the slow movement is a piece of fantastic delicacy. Some of the most exquisite sounds written for the piano at all in history, musical history, in this slow movement. Berlioz compared them to the instrument the celeste. And then finally from this emerges what you might call a kind of gigantic waltz, a symbol in a way of Beethoven's adopted hometown of Vienna, where the waltz was already beginning to emerge as a new sensation in the dance world. It's worth remembering, though, as you listen to this music, that this was, in fact, the last, well, of course it was the last of Beethoven's concertos, but it was the only one that he wasn't able to give the premiere of himself because his hearing was now so bad. And when you listen to those gorgeous sounds in some of the quieter passages in the slow movement and the exquisite filigree textures of the slow movement, remember that this is a pianist who can't hear the piano anymore. He's creating sounds like no one else has ever created for the piano before, but he's relying entirely on his own imagination and what little he could glean from touching the piano, from the vibrations as he felt it. It's a truly heroic achievement of a very different kind from the imperial swagger of the beginning of the concerto. And it's one of the things that makes this such a rich and complicated piece. There's a little joke near the end, I think, in a way, which is when near the end of the finale, this marvelous swaggering, as I said, titanic waltz, we come to the point where there's a cadenza. Now, usually in a concerto, the cadenza is played by the soloist alone or with the lightest possible accompaniment from the orchestra. But in this case, the timpani refuse to stop and they go on playing their dancing rhythm in the background all the time. It's as though Beethoven, having initially made this the piano's imperial concerto, look, see what the new more powerful modern pianos can achieve, is then saying, yes, but in the end, you've got to come to some sort of accommodation, you know, some sort of more subtle, more nuanced, more compromised relationship with the world. You can't just go on asserting yourself egoistically. And this little touch near the end is a fantastic example of that. It's as though the timpani is saying, well, no, you can't have the spotlight entirely for yourself. You can make wonderful, beautiful, magnificent noises, but I'm here to remind you that there's more to this world than you. And Beethoven has these lovely moments in his music. Terrific sense of humor the man had, which for some reason or other didn't always tend to come over in the older performances, the grand old performances of the great Germanic tradition. But it's something that's much more evident now, and I'm very glad, because it reminds us that, well, it may sometimes be a tigerish rather than a kittenish sense of playfulness, but it's certainly playfulness. And that's a side to Beethoven that we should appreciate too. He really is a multifaceted composer. And there's probably no greater proof of that than the wonderful Pastoral Symphony. Now, the Pastoral Symphony is so popular that some people tend to disparage it. But I think that actually popularity, well, sometimes crowds really do have their own wisdom. Because I can remember being a little bit snobby about the Pastoral Symphony myself at one stage and thinking, oh, well, this has been done to death. How many times have I heard this piece? This lovely evocation of pastoral moods. And then I heard a really beautiful performance of it. And I remember thinking, actually, this is one of the most beautiful things Beethoven ever wrote. He wrote it as a kind of celebration of the summer holidays he used to have outside the city of Vienna, and how important they were for his own reconstitution. We are with him, as it were, arriving in the country by the carriage, by horse and carriage in the first movement. You can feel his excitement and his pleasure mounting as he gets nearer his holiday destination. I'm sure many of us can identify with that. Then comes the wonderful scene by a brook, a scene in which you not only seem to hear the play of the water, but also the shadows cast by the trees, the sunlight through the trees on the surface of the water. And towards the end, Beethoven imitates the sounds of 3 bird calls on the woodwind. He actually names them in the score. And it's a lovely touch of literalism that you wouldn't expect in a Beethoven symphony, but there it is. Following this, an invocation of the sound of peasant merrymaking, which in Austria can actually be great fun even today. big celebrations, usually filled with lots and lots of local wine and beer. Then comes something very dramatic. Suddenly everything becomes darker and tenser, and we have little pattering noises, which are the first drops of rain, and a terrific elemental storm breaks out. Berlioz, who I mentioned earlier, hearing this, said, this isn't just a depiction of nature, this is nature in the roar. And you can imagine the crash of thunder, the flash of lightning. And then towards the end, as it all clears up, a little rising flute scale, it's almost as though you can hear the rainbow in the music at the end of the storm. A clarinet and then a horn echo a shepherd's piping, and the last movement is an ecstatic hymn to nature and to God in nature. As you listen to this, and its very many beautiful telling evocations of the moods and even the actual sounds of life in the country, remember again that the man who wrote this was writing nearly a decade earlier that he can't hear these things anymore. So he's relying on his memory and his extraordinary inner ear to translate those sounds into music, music the like of which no one had ever heard before. I do think that's an extraordinary achievement. And when people talk of heroism in Beethoven, I tend to think not so much of the great heaven-storming battle scenes that you might encounter in works like the Eroica Symphony or the Fifth Symphony. I think of these moments of great inner beauty when you almost seem to sense in the music what it was that gave Beethoven the strength to continue. This lonely man who never found the ideal love that he sought for most of his life, this man whose political ambitions were increasingly being thwarted, this man whose concert career had been brought to an end by his deafness, and who couldn't even hear the performances of his own music that were so crucial, of course, to his own reaffirmation and his sense of purpose. It's in this music, and particularly in that last movement, the hymn, that you really do get a sense of that inner strength, that sense, as one writer called it, of God within, that you get in Beethoven. Even if you don't believe in God, there is a sense in Beethoven that there's something that transcends his ego, a sense of strength that's way beyond personal determination or the sort of egoistic go-getting, you can have it all sort of sense that we encounter so much today, something far deeper than that. And I'm very grateful to Beethoven for the way that sometimes at difficult times of my life, he's awakened something similar in me. And it's clear that he does that for not only thousands of other people, but for millions of people too, 200 years and more after he wrote this music. Well, I think, Stravinsky was right when he said of a piece of Beethoven that it was contemporary forever. And in that sense, in the sense that Beethoven can meet us in our own trouble in this life and help us find, just as he did, the strength and purpose to keep going and to delight in existence and in life. Well, I think that sense he does remain contemporary and as relevant as anything that's being written today.